Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode, how hard could a Tyrannosaurus bite? And how do we know? Hello and welcome back to Series 8. 8, Dave, of Terrible Lizards. Can you believe it? We're 8.
When we started, I honestly wasn't sure if we'd get past 2. So I can... Given that we've also done, between series bonus episodes and the video things as well, I'm genuinely shocked that we've got this far.
Yes, if you haven't seen our videos, we do occasionally do live ones. If you check out our Facebook group or if you go on YouTube, I think it's youtube.com/IzzyTube, that is ISZITUBE, you can find all of our past... speaking to cameras over the internet and answering, the chat. That's what they call it, isn't it, Dave? The chat, the feed, as it comes up. And you can see our various living rooms. It's quite exciting. If you like spying...
Mine isn't, because my camera usually lines up with a white wall, so it's really not very exciting.
Well, talking of spying, because we delivered a little bonus extra for our patrons during the gap this last series, because you went all the way to Mongolia and did some digging of dinosaurs.
I did. I spent a lot of time on a plane and even longer in airport lounges. And for anyone who hasn't been yet, the new Istanbul airport is not very interesting, but by God, it is enormous. I had nearly 2 weeks in Mongolia on a dig for new scientists. So I was there accompanying a group of tourists effectively, and then going out with paleontologists from the famous Mongolian Institute of Paleontology, and basically prospecting a bit rather than doing classic excavations. And we found some nice bits and bobs. I genuinely don't know what I can talk about yet. I've been trying to get an answer from them of how. So some of them, there's photos posted online already, so I assume it's fine for me to talk about. I do actually want to check with them rather than get into their bad books of saying the wrong thing. But we went to some classic areas. So I've been to the Flaming Cliffs and the famous site of Velociraptor and the first dinosaur eggs of Roy Chapman Andrews from the Central Asiatic expedition in the 1930s. Went to a bunch of the famous AMNH, American Museum of Natural History sites that they found in 90s, I guess, maybe as early as the late 80s. But where, the nesting oviraptor, Big Mama, Oviraptorosaur, I should say, came from, went to one of the Dinocyrus, not the Dinocyrus site, but the Dinocyrus formation area, and some other places like this. I don't think we found Pterygordius material, we found Tarbosaurus material, found a whole bunch of Ornithomimosaur material. Found a sauropod. They're not very common out there, so that was nice. Lots of these are bits rather than good. Found some poached stuff, which is obviously rather less exciting, but rather depressing, and saw some really cool stuff in the museums.
See, that's the best. That's where I look for all of my dinosaurs. If I'm not down,
it's much easier to find them. I'll be honest. And they come with labels as well, and usually there's no rock in the way, so you just have to get past a bit of glass. I can highly recommend that as a prospecting. But they complained when I started putting it in my suitcase and writing Queen Mary University of London on it. So it swings and roundabouts.
But you did survive a storm on the steppe, because I heard this in your audio diary.
It blows something fierce and then so, and it was absolutely freezing for a couple of nights, which it's towards the end of the summer and it wasn't that warm, but equally, although we're in Mongolia, I tried to work it out exactly on the map, but it was only about 40 or 50 miles from where I was when I was digging in northern China, because of course Triceratops and similar faunas are just across the border, because that's obviously a, let's say, relatively recent border that's come across, and geology doesn't ascribe to those lines. So I really wasn't far away from where I've been before geographically, and in a similar time of year and fairly similar conditions. So I'm well aware that it can get pretty cold at night when the wind's blowing, but boy, did it cold at night when the wind was blowing. And I can't imagine what it was like, even 3 or 4 weeks later, let alone come January. God, it must be cold.
But this is why you have nice yurts, although you call them gers, I think. In your
They told us that the correct pronunciation is ger. I think it's one of those slightly odd ancient translation things, in the way that Peking, as the old name for the Chinese capital, and now Beijing, is the same thing in Mandarin. It's just there was a different translation system for the characters that gave slightly weird pronunciations. So I think that, the Mongolians were like, these are gers. We don't know why people call them yurts. And it's like everyone that I know of says the Mongolian tent is called a yurt, but I will take your word for it as the Mongolian who lives in one. Fair enough.
Well, welcome to Terrible Canvases. But yes, we thought this series, instead of exhausting Dave's already pretty mined knowledge about the world of dinosaurs, we could mine some of his friends' knowledge about dinosaurs, because believe it or not, Dave has friends in the paleontology world.
Well, hopefully they believe that. We've had a couple of them on before, to be fair.
This is true, but we thought we'd make a special sort of series where we can get proper nerdy about really specific things. We've done some broad topics like Tyrannosaurs, but we haven't talked about specifically how they bite, how we know how they bite, and the different type. Literally, we've got an entire episode on how you know how hard is hard the right word, Dave? Is that right?
We're talking about biomechanics, which I play around the edges of this, and obviously we've talked quite extensively about diets and feeding ecology and predation and stuff in theropods, but biomechanics is something I know the bare bones of, and I always rely on other people. Yes, very good. I always rely on other people to kind of really help me through it, or frankly just do it, and it's like, well, let's talk about that, because that is a really interesting side of things, and we've never really dealt with it in detail.
So now let us introduce to you Manabu, who is an expert in biomechanics of chompy chomp chomp rars, and we're going to get proper nerdy.
Today we've got Manabu Sakamoto, who is a very old friend of mine, and I think you were doing your master's when I was doing my PhD.
Yeah, that's correct.
But did you start your PhD before I'd finished?
Yeah, I think so. I carried on to do a PhD pretty much straight after.
We sort of overlapped twice, but of course that there goes back to like 2002, so 20 years ago now.
2003, 2004.
Yeah, there we go. So halfway through my PhD, before I ran off to Germany.
I'd started my undergraduate.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Izzy was around at the same time. So we're all in Bristol together.
Okay.
I actually taught you, I think, a little bit on that master's programme. Possibly
yes, you did, indeed, yeah.
A couple of classes. Manabu does theropod stuff, and so over the years we've obviously kept in touch because we're kind of doing similar and parallel things. We're on 1 or 2 papers together that came out of various bits. But although obviously I do a lot of theropod stuff, and I do a lot of ecology stuff, which is kind of his thing, he's really a biomechanicist and getting into the actual numbers of how hard did things bite, how fast did things bite, what could they process and how, which really I look at but I don't really work on. And so he does provide, let's say, a stream of stuff which is beyond what I would normally do, and why I thought it would therefore be good to get him on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how you'd work out for it. Should we do the biting? Because I like biting. It sounds fun. So is that a case of just measuring a lot of other animals, like strength bites, and then extrapolating somehow from that? Or is there, how do you go around working out how hard something bit?
So yeah, that's a good question. So like you kind of suggested there, one way to do it is to compare how various different animals bite in the living animals. If you can go around and collect bite forces by like sticking a force transducer in its mouth and prompting it to bite down on it, and then you record that data, right?
Have you actually done that yourself, or are you using it?
No, I have not done that.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
I take the other approach that I'm going to get on to next, but this is kind of one way to do it is to record lots of data, like bite force data from living animals who may or may not be willing participants, but you prompt them to bite down.
Ideally not willing, presumably, because if they're not willing, they're going to bite harder, presumably.
Well, yeah, that's one of the issues surrounding this, that you never really know if they're biting down maximally. But experiments using involuntary, you can. I think this was like years before ethics got in the way. But there are studies where researchers zapped the muscles with electricity, and the muscles and that would basically generate like an actual maximum muscle-driven bite force, basically involuntary. The animal's not controlling it at all. It's just that's how much it could bite by just like if you stimulate the muscles to its maximum. And by that, you can actually get maximum bite force. And sometimes some animals, especially the more what we might think simpler animals. So if within like mammals, it might be something like marsupials, right? Those kind of animals tend to bite voluntarily close to the maximum that they're physically capable of doing. So if you stimulate muscles and they actually just contract maximally, it really matches the voluntary bite forces. So things like opossums, for instance, can bite really hard, and they seem to bite fruit like their max.
I'm sorry, I'm giggling because I have been bitten by an opossum several times when I was in South America, and it certainly bit me very hard indeed.
Yeah, they don't seem to have restraints in that sense. Whereas I think a lot of other more, I don't know, like placental mammals are more closer to us in a way, relationalized, like things like cats and dogs and, primates seem to have a little bit more restraint about how they bite, because I guess they feel a bit more pain in their teeth when they bite down really hard.
Or they're just, nicer, maybe.
Well, maybe they are. And a lot of these data come from zoo animals, and they probably don't really, get that aggressive, perhaps. But so if you collect enough of these data in various different types of mammals, different birds, different lizards, as many taxa, species as you can across the tree of life, anything that really bites down and is fairly big enough. And then you can basically plot a chart of like bite force on the y-axis or on the vertical axis against, I don't know, something like body size or head size, something that you can measure easier than bite force. And then if you get a relationship, as an animal gets bigger or has bigger head size, for instance, then you can predict body size, bite force just based on something that you can measure. And so if you have that kind of relationship and data to back it up, then you can estimate something like body size in dinosaurs, or you can measure the head size, like head width of dinosaurs, and then you can predict bite force that way. People have done it in the past. I've got a more sophisticated way of doing it. The approach I take is I actually then incorporate the tree of life on it. So in a way, you kind of use the data from the living animals, but you can extrapolate back and predict bite force in dinosaurs based on where they lie on the tree of life. So basically the relationship can go back to the root and then come back up along the branches, and it kind of evolves up in a way. So it's a little bit more sophisticated way you can do it, but the principle is the same, where you have data that backing up a prediction.
Okay.
That's one way to do it. And statistically, I think the way that including the tree of life seems to give pretty good prediction accuracy. So in my analyses, my predictions are, this isn't boasting, it's just statistically, my predictions based on assessment of the accuracy is about 95 to 98% accurate. It's very accurate.
That's very good.
Yeah. I bet your F&P tests and t-tests do very well.
Yeah, so the p-values are, p-values are less than 0.05 is basically, right?
I was going to say, if people want to see this, Greg Erickson, who's a colleague of ours, who's in Florida, I can't remember which university, Greg's done lots of stuff on bite force and T-Rex bite force in particular. And being in Florida, every time there's basically ever a dinosaur documentary, particularly if T-Rex is involved, there will be a video of Greg Erickson going to the local alligator park and sticking one of these bite force meters in the mouth of an alligator. I have seen it in at least 4 different documentaries, and it's different video every time. I think like every 6 weeks, Greg gets in his car, drives down there with a film crew and pokes something in an alligator's mouth for it to bite.
Is he just very antagonistic to an alligator? Do alligators, when they see him, just want to bite?
I mean, at this point, they must be sick of it.
Yeah, I think we need to build one ourselves and then try to go around sticking in animal mouths. And
I mean, if you've got one, I mean, quite serious offer. This probably won't make the edit, but I've got a couple of contacts at Crocodiles of the World up at Bryce Norton, and they've been willing to be involved in experiments.
Cool.
And John Hutchinson's done some stuff with them, so I am perfectly sure they would let you poke a crocodile.
Yeah, because we can get
force.
specs from those papers, and then like build one. Get the engineering, mechanical engineering workshop to build one for you.
Now that is a student. We're very keen on group student projects, so we'll see if the engineers want to build something for us to poke alligators with.
Yeah, and then we, I don't know who would be willing volunteers, but they, they'd have to kind of risk a limb or something.
So that isn't what you do, though. So you can extrapolate from the data, but if you want to go beyond just collecting data of snappy snaps, you can actually, you you've worked out a method of working out how hard a dinosaur could bite.
Biomechanical modeling is using mechanical principles, so physics, because the idea is that the physics don't really change over millions of years. So if you have a kind of like a snappy snap kind of jaw system that has a joint at the back and it's being powered by muscles, right? So that basically is kind of like you're lifting a lever with the muscles, pulling up a jaw, which is a lever. And then so when that jaw contacts food and it's biting down with its muscles, it generates a reaction force in response to this. The muscle pulling is reacting to something hitting that lever. Basically, it's a food being crushed by the teeth. And so that's basically how bite forces are generated, right? So the muscle force is being transmitted along this jaw to the bite point, the teeth, and it's being applied on the food.
So your muscle in your jaw gets shorter, contracts, and your bottom jaw comes up, traps it, and that's the bite force applied on. So the bite force isn't the muscle in the jaw, it's literally the force applied to whatever it is you're biting on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically the actual pressure that's exerted onto the food item, whatever it is. So, it's crushing
jelly,
food.
Ice cream.
Jelly, ice cream, maybe, like, bones sometimes, right? And they will just crush that food item. That crushing force is bite force. And ultimately that is generated by the muscles. But how much of that muscle force can be transferred into bite force depends on how long the lever is.
I get this. As somebody with very, very, very long limbs and having to do like work at the gym where you like lift, doing lat raises where you're lifting a smaller weight further away from you is a lot harder when you've got longer limbs than it is when you've got short limbs. This is what I tell the gym instructors, but they don't seem to believe me. But it's true. That's
exactly what it is. Like, so you can change the lever on a machine as well, right? You can adjust it to your body size and body shape. And you can make it easier by moving the in lever where you position your hands, for instance, forward and closer to the load, which is the heavy weight bit. So that's how you apply the work. That's how you work out, and you can change that to make different parts of your body work under different situations, right? So the same thing applies with where the muscle attaches on the jaw as well. So the farther forwards the muscle can attach, the closer that muscle force vector is to the biting position. And that you can then transfer the muscle force directly to bite force if those 2 points are close together.
So if you imagine like a heron with a big long beak with the cheeks really far back, that's going to have less of a bite force than something like, I don't know, something smaller, but like a finch, which has got quite a short beak and its cheeks are right on the beak.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good example of that. And another similar thing would be something like parrots, which moves that muscle forward even more.
T-Rex has a very short skull. Spinosaurus, for example, doesn't. That's a fundamental part of that leverage. But also I'd add in that dinosaurs happily have very simple skulls in the sense of them operating like a lever. If you're trying to do this with things with complex jaws, so mammals can flex their jaws in lots of different directions. Things like snakes have joints in the jaws and lizards. Dinosaurs, we're very lucky, are relatively simple. And that makes at least some of the mechanics and some of the analyses rather easier. But I'd also point out that you've also got this annoying second level trade-off. And I think T-Rex is a great illustration of this. If you look at those teeth, the biggest teeth are in the middle. Now that sounds slightly odd when Manabu's just said your strongest bite is at the back of the jaw because it's closer to the lever. But you've also got to fit it in the mouth. And so you've got a trade-off between, can you open the mouth wide enough to get the thing into it you want to bite and get it far back enough whilst also delivering that power? And so it's very obvious that the biggest teeth, and it's not just T-Rex, it's just the best example of this, are right in the middle of the jaw, because there is this trade-off between, I want it as far back as possible to be as strong as possible, but if it's too far back, I can't get my mouth around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. And then so, like Dave just said, a lot of the theropod teeth, dinosaurs have the longest teeth, usually in the middle of the snout, the jaw, the tooth row. And that's presumably where it would have bitten. And so that's, one way to increase your biting efficiency, as if you want to call it that, is to move the lever, so where the muscle is positioned. But the other thing that you could do is to increase the muscle size, which things like T-Rex does. Varying the muscle size actually has a lot more effect on the outcome, bite force, than it does varying the distances.
Okay.
So yeah, you can move the muscle forward a little bit or back a little bit, and it will make a little bit of a difference. But changing that muscle size by even a little bit makes a much bigger impact on the outcome, the bite force.
So how do you know how big a muscle was on an animal that's been extinct for, 65 million years.
So yeah, that's an excellent question. So because muscles don't fossilize, except under certain, exceptional conditions and under exceptional circumstances, the fossilization environment is so perfect that it actually preserves muscles. But even in those cases, they usually don't preserve jaw muscles. And even if they were preserved, they're usually like this squished black kind of mess that you just can't tell anything apart. I've never seen jaw muscles preserved at all in any of this, publications that or any,
I haven't seen
in the fossils.
anything.
No.
Well, I haven't either, so.
So muscles, you can't really use the fossil record to just measure, but you can deduce muscles by the size of the skull itself. In reptiles, unlike mammals, well, mammals too to some extent, but reptiles, especially things like dinosaurs, there's like these chambers at the back of the skull, right next to the brain case. So they have fairly small brains considering their skull size, their body size, they're really, really small brains. So they have a lot of space at the back, like very big open spaces. And comparing the architecture, like the general geometry of the skull in that region with modern relatives, lizards and tuatara have very similar kind of skull arrangements. In terms of actual relationships, birds and crocodiles are the closest relatives of dinosaurs, or, birds are dinosaur descendants. But the skull architecture, the geometry is more similar to something like lizards or tuatara, like the sphenodon from New Zealand. So if you look at all those animals and look and collect data or anatomical measurements and, observations of the jaw muscles, you actually have a fairly good idea of how much of that space is filled up by muscles. They have a lot of jaw muscles at the back of the skull. And sometimes the one that go from the back, it's called a pterygoidius, it come from the pterygoid, the palate, and attaches at the bottom of the jaw, close to the jaw joint. That one wraps around and comes outside. So it's actually, if you see like a iguana or even an alligator, they have these massive necks. Yeah, and that's not a neck, that's the part of the jaw muscle. So they have these really bulky, bulging jaw muscles on their side of their chin at the back of the jaw.
That makes Mr. Olympia contestants, because you see weightlifters, bodybuilders get these big square jaw, like even women, and they're not necessarily taking any steroids or anything like that. It's literally just because they grit their teeth and they build these muscles and they get the big jaw muscles here. But if an iguana did that, it's the muscles on its neck are just going to go.
Sometimes you see this in crocs, in zoo, crocodilians, alligators in zoos, and they're absolutely extraordinary. And one thing to add is that for crocodilians, the pterygoidius muscles is one of the places they can put down fat bodies. So actually, if you've got a crocodile in a zoo, which isn't doing very much, and then it's being fed, it will get super fat pterygoidius because it's actually put loads of fat down. So occasionally you get people who see them in zoos and go, oh my God, that animal must have the greatest bite power of anything in history because it's got these pair of enormous, like, footballs under its jaw. And it's like, no, it's just really fat.
Yeah, so the pterygordius muscle is a really difficult one to constrain because it bulges outside. But a lot of the ones that attach on the temporal region, so around the eyes and behind the brain, around the sides of this brain case, they're actually constrained by the chamber that's there. So the skull has like this, almost like a truss-like framework, like almost like a bicycle frame where you got these thin kind of bones surrounding the brain case and making this boxy frame. And inside that boxy frame, it's packed with muscles. So if you can get measurements like, of that skeletal geometry, and then if you have data about muscles, so you can collect the number of fibers that are in there, the weight, the cross-sectional area of the muscles. If you get all those measurements from muscles, and then you can correlate that with the size of the adductor chamber. So they're called adductor muscles, the jaw closing muscles, that chamber. If you can get the physical geometries and measurements from that, then you can correlate and deduce what kind of size muscles were inside the dinosaur's skull, just by the relationship that you have with the bone and the bone size and the muscle size in living animals.
And so is this an equation that you then work out? So you work out if this muscle is this length, this muscle is this length, and you just end up with a number at the end.
Yeah. So muscle fibers are interesting. So even though we have something like a rat or a mouse that's very small, up to something like an elephant or even something like T-Rex, and they're so different in body size, but each of the individual muscle fibers contract at the same force. Basically, a single muscle fiber from a mouse contracts at the same force as a single muscle fiber from an elephant.
Okay.
So the main difference being that there's more muscle fibers in elephant muscles than there are in a mouse. Some people have contested this, but I think it's stood the test of time. It's been repeated from this seems to be overall, on average, the case. So we're always talking about on average, right? So typically that seems to be the case. So if you could figure out the mass of a muscle, so if you assume that all of the muscles are parallel to each other and as a single bundle of muscle is all just fibers bundled together, then you can work out how many muscle fibers there were based on the weight, the mass of the muscle, and some, calculations about the density and the length of the fibers. And you can work out the area, which means how many fibers there are. Then that way you can work out the area, the cross-section area, which is equivalent to the number of fibers. So you can work out the number of fibers. You can work out the force of the muscles, right, being generated by that muscle. And then you can plug that into that lever calculation we talked about before, and then work out by force. But in reality, life isn't so simple. And jaw muscles are a bit okay, but muscles aren't always parallel fibers. They have these what's called pinnated. So they look like feathers.
Right.
So they might have like a central kind of tendon that's running from the area of origin to the insertion site. So where it attaches on both sides of the bone, on the bone system. And then instead of having these parallel fibers running parallel to that line of action of the muscle, they might be fanning out like you'd see in a bird feather.
And why is that? Is that to just sort of give the muscle itself some more strengthening in different directions?
These are more theoretical ideas behind it, but modeling and experiments tend to show that as the muscle is contracting the direction of those angles change.
Okay.
So in a way, it's some more. So traditionally, it was thought that it packs more muscle fibers into a smaller volume. So if you have like a cylinder, and then you're packing, lots of chopsticks in there. Yeah. Then you can only fit as many as the diameter of that cylinder, right? Mm-hmm. But if you had like lots of toothpicks stacked and combined together oriented diagonally in that tube, you can stack more of these same diameter little toothpicks. If you cut lots of chopsticks into toothpick sizes and you pack them diagonally into that same tube, you can pack more chopsticks that way. So in a way, it's a space saving mechanism, but you can pack more muscle fibers into the same space by having it diagonally oriented like feathers.
But that won't have the same sort of force as everything working directly in one.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So because they're pulling diagonally, you do lose a bit of force.
But it's worth it for the amount of extra force you get because you've got more in there. Okay.
But that's one theoretical idea behind it. But recent analyses, like kind of more like biomechanical theoretical modeling, show that because muscles contract and that angle of pennation change, overall, if you compare the force generated through pinnated muscles and those parallel muscles, apparently it doesn't really make much difference. So it seems to be more the case that you're having a lot of these diagonal muscles, then as the muscle is contracting, it might be working in a way that it's generating force consistently across that whole length of the whole duration of that contraction.
So it's not like leveling off at the very end, or
exactly,
it's not really intense at the very end.
Yeah, exactly.
It's intense all the way through.
Clever. Yeah. So if you have like long muscle fibers, you don't have like tension, that consistent tension all the way through that contraction, right? So if you got a really massively stretched, like muscle fiber, and you're contracting, that tension isn't going to be the same throughout this contraction process. And the more distance you're covering, the more of that kind of, like you said, it kind of tapers off more. Whereas if you have shorter fibers that are almost like the same kind of distances, and then they all kind of maintain that similar amount of contraction at different phases throughout that whole contraction phase. As the whole muscle body is contracting, each of the muscle fibers are contracting a little bit shorter distances, right? So then that seems to me be able to maintain a more consistent contraction across the entire motion of that whole muscle body. So that's a newer idea that's been proposed recently.
I like that idea. That's clever.
It might have been around, but there was a paper that came out fairly recently that talked about it.
It does make a lot of sense though, because I was about to sort of just do a glib of going, well, it works, so evolution is a bodge job, so it's probably just a bodge job. But that actually does make more sense, because last thing you want is like a contraction which actually is so violent or something like that you actually drop it because it forces you to open your jaw again, or something that's so weak to begin with that anything can run away before you've actually got a good hold of it.
Yeah. Well, biomechanicists and engineers like to think about optimum, shape and optimum function things. But in reality, what you just mentioned about evolution being a little bit more like error prone in a way. So it's actually more real. So in a way, I think it's the combination of optimal function and good enough, It's a good enough kind of architecture.
with jaws in particular, they're used for so many things. We think of them as being, even in a theropod, it bites stuff to kill it and it bites other stuff to chop it up and swallow it. And that's about it. But of course, they don't. They will do weird things like dig for water with them. And sometimes they've got to grab a fish and sometimes they've got to grab something much more muscly like a dinosaur tail. And at other times they've got to crunch a bone. And so, again,
and also do things like move eggs.
But Manabu's talking about that optima, and I think that's a trap. I think we've talked about this before where, engineers and physicists, when they try to do biology, and they think there's a solution to a problem because things do a thing. And, of course, they don't. They do loads and loads and loads of different things, and there's all these different selective pressures where, you're right, they've got to move eggs occasionally, and it's very rare, but it's very important that they do it right when they do it. Otherwise, they don't have offspring, and their selection just flattens them in, that lineage instantly. And so, something that might be incredibly rare is also absolutely critical under natural selection. And so, this idea, and I think it is a really common trap, and not just for engineers and physicists, but also for other people just thinking about biology and becoming new to these topics, tend to think of single things having single functions, and that's very rarely the case. Even you think something like an ear, you go, oh, well, your ear, it's for hearing. Yeah, and balance. It's trying to do two different things, both of which are important, and almost certainly one of them will compromise the other. And so, there's always these incredibly complicated trade-offs going on that we almost certainly can't begin to understand other than to know that they're out there and guess a couple of the big ones. T-Rex's skull is clearly built to deliver colossal bite power. It's not the only thing it's doing.
I think that's really cool, the trade-offs that we don't really know a lot about trade-offs. So we can estimate muscle forces, we can estimate bite force based on that, and then we can then model biomechanically what those bite forces do to a skull. When a dinosaur is biting into something, like a T-Rex is biting down on bone, and then what kind of stresses are being exerted onto the skull, right? And then those stress distribution patterns and whether a skull is stronger under certain load or how much load it can tolerate until it shatters, for instance. Those patterns don't necessarily, I think the more we study biomechanics, especially biting behavior, and try to correlate that with skull shape, correlate that with ecology, there seems to be a lot more messiness there, like noise. So those biomechanical performances don't always align with the shape of the skull, as you'd expect or predict, for instance. And sometimes the shape of the skulls and beaks and snouts, for instance, don't really necessarily correlate with diet and ecology, as you'd expect, beyond a broad level of this is a seed eater or this is a fish eater. So anything beyond that, any more details, it becomes really noisy, messy, and it doesn't really have a one-to-one correlation between function and shape. And that, I think, is what Dave is saying about trade-offs. So the skull or the beak might be, or snout or whatever you're looking at, performs multiple functions, and they're under selection for different things. So it's very difficult to tease those things apart.
It might just be that a big square jaw on a T-Rex is more attractive. It had nothing to do with the necessary bite force. But female T-Rex might have selected for a certain look and style of neck.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Dave's expertise, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unlikely with things like that. But I remember Snorri Sigurdsson. He was a master's student, but for his master's project he did with me, I had him measuring loads and loads and loads of bird beaks to try and break down even that far. And even that compromised itself out of existence. I mean, it's well, surely the finches will well separate from the seed-eating finches will separate from the insect eaters, and they'll separate from the early fish eaters, and they'll separate from storks and herons and stuff. And I'm slightly exaggerating, this is 20 years ago. But he just got this horrible smear where it turns out that it's surprisingly hard to tell just basic diet in things like bird beaks, because for all the ones that are clear and obvious, there are also loads and loads that really aren't. I think the example I always like of this is kingfishers, which we call kingfishers because that's the English term for that. But if you look at the group as a whole, less than half of them eat fish. Most of them are just predators of small things like lizards and mammals and big insects.
Aren't kookaburras kingfishers?
Kookaburras are the largest kingfisher, and they don't normally eat fish. Most of them, so I've seen loads of them in Africa, and they're little forest predators. And that really big spear-like beak is good for murdering mice and crickets and lizards and baby birds and things like this. It also, as it turns out, quite good for fish, which is why some of them do that. But it's not a fishing beak. It's a murdering animal smaller than you beak.
It's the beak everybody wants.
But yeah, and that's compromise. And I think birds show it in particular because they do lots of weird things, and in particular nest building, where beaks are really, really important. Whereas most other animals at least can use their hands. And okay, humans are exceptional in that regard. But, we've all seen, dogs will hold sticks with their paws. A bird really can't do that because it's standing on its feet. And if it's manipulating stuff with its feet, that causes other problems. And so beaks become way more important as environmental manipulators. So this can cause all kinds of other problems and correlates with those trade-offs.
I don't know whether to ask you about whether you've done computer models, so you've actually built a skull and done that thing that I've seen on TV that you get those we go into the computer, we build the skull and then we crush things virtually. Have you ever done that sort of thing?
So I haven't done that kind of thing. My biomechanical models are more first principle. So basically calculating muscle parameters and then putting that into those kind of linear equations, which are, very simple, but that kind of gets the same answer. And I am working on developing a collaborative project with Emily Rayfield in Bristol and Phil Anderson in the United States. So they're biomechanics people that do different things to what I do. So I have a proposal that would go into more of that kind of computational, three-dimensional computational work to try to test the specific hypothesis I have about biting. But to this day, I haven't really delved into that kind of computational modeling, but I have been working with simpler models. The beauty of simpler models, and I just have to really shamelessly plug this in, is that because they're simple, they kind of get to the universal kind of aspect of, principles. So you're testing first principles. You're not concerned with the details of how the different small little bits of the morphology or the structures are affecting your models, biomechanical models. So it's just, they're very simple, but they get to the bottom of things. You can it's easier to test specific hypotheses because you're using simple models.
Yeah, I'm really curious as to what these hypotheses are. Is there a sort of law about chewing and biting?
Well, I think the simplest law or rule would be scaling. So how do bite forces scale with body size? So is body size the only determinant of bite force? So we do know that bite force correlate with body size. So as animals get bigger, you get higher, tougher biting force. But there's been a lot of hypotheses about are different dietary categories associated with different average bite forces. So maybe bone biters might have higher bite forces than you'd expect for its body size. Maybe seed eaters might have higher bite forces than you'd expect compared to its body size, stuff like that. Do that scaling relationship, that slope of gradient of change in bite force with body size, is that the same across the different groups of animals? So for instance, across mammals, across reptiles, within birds, within dinosaurs, and is there a shift from the dinosaur bird transition, for instance, right? So those kind of questions are answered fairly more easily if you have a simpler input data for it, and simple biomechanical models like bite force or lever mechanics is a way to get to it.
I also like championing simple models because I don't think anyone would argue that really complicated, detailed models that really work through all the possible parameters and everything else aren't very, very valuable. But I'd also say that, again, in my admittedly limited experience, but an awful lot of the times they bring out almost exactly the same results as the old ones. Yeah. And when you consider the computational time or the effort or the amount of data that's required, so for dinosaurs, we need a 3D perfectly preserved skull with every single element intact and in situ, versus it turns out that actually we've done all of that ludicrously complicated stuff. And if you want an answer that's 99% as accurate, you need to measure these three things, and you can kind of estimate them if you have to. This is great because when we do bigger and bigger and bigger studies and you have to generate this data, this is a real deal.
And then they had something that's in between, which is called the extruded model, where they make a 2D model, but they add a little bit of depth to it. And then it was interesting. So the extruded model matched better with the 3D model, but overall, the 2D model did pretty well in terms of capturing the general kind of principle of how a jaw performs under certain kind of biting load. And then also other people like like Stefan Lautenschlager. He spent a lot of time doing all these 2D models, and he's increased the sample size of things like saber-toothed tigers, for instance, right? And then done all these 2D models, FE models, and put them onto a phylogenetic tree, the tree of life. And then he mapped the evolution of biting performance. And that's really cool. Like, you can only really do that if you have like a really big sample size, really, really big data set over hundreds of species. And those simple models allow you to collect data really quickly, consistently. And if you have done all that groundwork of demonstrating that your simple model is good at approximating real life, performances, then you can go on and do those statistical analyses, right?
It reminds me of a load of people doing the weather this, because occasionally you just have to look and go, feels a bit like this today. Or you can do a really detailed, and because the amount of data you can collect for weather analysis is huge, and the amount that the meteorologist actually uses relatively small in order to get, and the results, you could be really detailed and have what the weather's doing in Cancun yesterday, it's how that feeds into the likelihood it might rain in Yorkshire, compared to just the very simple, this is the pressure, this is, the humidity and stuff, this is what's likely to happen. And so the simpler it is, actually, the difference in accuracy is pretty, for the layman, it's the same.
Yeah. So that's a very good demonstration of overfitting and prediction. So the difference between precision and accuracy in a way, right? So if you have a highly precise model that could predict under very specific conditions, so you have a model that is basically overfitted to a certain set of conditions. So under those same conditions, you can predict very precisely what's going to happen. But as soon as you project into this kind of unknown space where the combination of those factors become much more complex, like into the future where you don't really know, then those overfitted models might actually predict wrongly, inaccurately, but precisely completely wrong, right? The model will be highly precise, but it might be completely wrong because that future projection doesn't match the same conditions as those data that went into the training set, right? So under those conditions, what you said about simple parameters might actually have a better prediction accuracy because those things are the ones that universally kind of holds the same kind of trend, the same kind of patterns. So, temperature might be a good one to predict aridity, for instance. So it could be like general atmospheric temperature with the humidity might actually predict something like rainfall a little bit better. And I think that's the part of the problem with things like financial market modeling is like they have these highly volatile models that, that change a lot, but they can't predict very well because they can explain previous behavior, but they struggle with forecast.
But when you're trying to work out how hard things could bite, surely, therefore, the more data you have on the evolutionary tree might overcomplicate absolutely everything that you're trying to work out and extrapolate as well. Is it just a case of select for this and then randomly sample and see if your model fits everything? Or is it, how do you do it?
I think there's different ways of modeling. Generally there's two approaches. One is called the backward elimination, which starts off with a highly complex model and you take away bits and bits from it until you have a stable model that explains the same kind of patterns without losing the general essence of it with fewer parameters, right? So that's when you start with a really complex model and you eliminate things from it. The other is forward selection, where you keep adding new stuff to your model. So you start off with a simple one that you think is like a good model that describes the whole thing. But then you think like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of variation that's not really, not just a little, but quite a bit of variation that's not really accounted for by this simple model. So we're going to add this other parameter that we think might actually help. And then you keep adding, but you also realize that some of the parameters, if you add a new one, that old parameter, that other parameter that you put in isn't really explaining anymore. So maybe they're actually redundant. So you take one of them out and then see which one does better. You can combine putting new ones in.
This is like trying to bake a cake recipe and not knowing what makes it delicious.
Well, exactly, yeah. So yeah, but there's going to be a crucial ingredient that you can never take out, right? Like flour and butter and sugar. But you need something that does the same thing, right? So flour could be replaced by something else, gluten-free equivalent, right? But they do the same thing, right? They kind of put in the carb element of it, and also they stick the stuff together, I guess. Basically, it does the same thing, right? So in modeling, that's essentially you're doing the same thing. You put in the elements that explain certain aspects of the data, and you could replace with something that is redundant. But if you put both of them in, it just becomes a completely redundant model. So you don't put like, chickpeas and flour together or egg whites together, right? Because those things are redundant. You don't need them together. So if you put sugar in, you don't put in a sugar alternative. But you can, but it just kind of eats into the other and it just kind of ruins it, right?
I think what we need to know is how hard could theropods bite? Are they the equivalent of modern day animals? Could they bite much harder? Have anything surprised you in your analysis of different dinosaurs and their actual ability to crunch?
To answer that first bit, I think because theropods are much bigger than modern animals, their bite forces are much higher on average. Even the non-tyrannosaur ones, Tyrannosaurus is known to have really, really massive high bite forces, powerful, really, really powerful bites. But even the non-tyrannosaurs, like the allosaurs and all these other dinosaurs, they also bit quite hard. So they were probably on the range of maybe like twice the power of the biggest crocodiles around today, for instance. So they did bite really hard, just because of the pure size. So their muscles they have a lot of muscle because they're big.
I think people just forget the size of theropods because we're so used to thinking about like really, really big theropods. But if you think about something, relatively honest, Megalosaurus, the skull of Megalosaurus is, okay, it's very incomplete, but, it might be in the realm of 30, 40 centimeters. That is positively a very, very moderate mid to small theropod. And yet its skull is bigger than a lion, which is about as big as a carnivore gets these days, terrestrially. And, and this is into the bottom half of theropod sizes. I mean, Manabu's right, like body size is just such a key component, but just to forget that, no, theropods are absolutely massive.
All right, then. What about things like a Microraptor, though? Would that have a higher bite capacity than like a crow? Because they're very similar sort of sized animals.
I don't know. I think it probably bit about the same kind of strength as like a small, like a raven or the similar sized lizard or whatever, with a probably bit kind of similar kind of amount. So talking about size differences, smaller animals, I think, tend to have a little bit more interesting patterns of relatively large, higher or relatively lower bite force, because they're a lot more sensitive to the things that they could eat or they can't eat based on their biting power. But if you get above a certain size, you don't really need to develop specifically higher bite force to eat most things. Like lions could crunch bones just because they're big. But so they don't have the same kind of adaptations that hyena do. But hyena have these massive teeth that allow them to bite easier, but the force that they're generating from their muscles aren't that much different from lions or similar sized carnivores. So once you get to a certain size, a lot of the adaptations you see in terms of diet aren't necessarily bite force related, but they're more like the skull size of the teeth or the robustness of the teeth, for instance. But when you're on the smaller end, if you can't bite through like a seed shell, or if you can't crush an insect, then you can't be an insectivore or you can't be a seed eater, right? So those at the smaller end of scale, yeah, those things do matter. But whether or not Microraptor a bit harder than what you'd expect for its body size is a little bit difficult, because a lot of these muscle parameters are actually based on measurements that are tightly correlated with body size.
Fair enough.
So you're kind of estimating a bite force that is within range of what you'd expect for its body size.
If we're saying that, beyond a certain body size, it doesn't really matter, the shape of the jaw and how adapted the jaw is. It is just a matter of, you're big, you're going to bite hard. So why would it matter, therefore, if a modern crocodile could probably take down something that these creatures are eating, why would they need to have such big, like the T-Rex has got a huge skull with a huge jaw. So what does it tell us about how the T-Rex lived that it needed such a big bite? So
that's a really good question. So despite what I said about size being really crucial, now above a certain size, you don't necessarily need to change bite force that much. If you compare something like Carcharodontosaurus or Giganotosaurus, which are on the same size scale as T-Rex, and I've got bite force estimates for Carcharodontosaurus, they're about half the strength of a T-Rex, even though they're about the same size. And that's partly because the skull of T-Rex is much wider than Carcharodontosaurus, and it does have like twice as much bite force, and it's definitely using that bite force for something different from what Carcharodontosaurus would do. Carcharodontosaurus has a more typical theropod kind of skull shape. So it has a relatively narrow skull with a longer snout. And so what it was doing was probably more typical for what a large-bodied theropod would have been doing. But T-Rex was doing something completely different from anything of these other large-bodied theropods. And I think a large part of that was because it was chomping through its prey, bone and all. So it was basically crunching down on whatever it was eating and mashing it up and swallowing it whole. So you have fossil evidence of whole Triceratops pelvis being bitten in half through repetitive biting. And then the coprolites, which are fossil poo of T-Rex, have these completely pulverized bone shards in it. So it was basically eating bone, swallowing it all, digesting it, and it was pooping it out. It was eating bone habitually as part of its diet, but this is where it gets really controversial and people get really, really emotional about this, is whether or not T-Rex was eating dead animals or whether T-Rex hunted down and killed animals and ate the entire body. That's where it gets a little bit debated. But the matter of the fact is, it had such a high bite force, and the fossil evidence also supports this, that it could crush its prey, flesh, bone, and all, and chomp it up, swallow it whole. And that's the lifestyle that T-Rex was leading. And what compelled it to do it through evolutionary time is, who knows? But it just basically got so big, so like the apex predator of North America and parts of Asia, I guess, that it really didn't care what it was eating. It would just eat anything in its way, bone and all, really.
I'm going to disagree slightly with what you said. I don't think you said anything wrong as such. I just slightly interpret it differently. So yeah, the famous T-Rex coprolite is of a juvenile hadrosaur that's been bitten up. And actually the bone's really quite intact, so I think they're very bad at digesting bone because crocs pass out slurry from much thicker bones. So I think they're not actually a bone feeder. I think some people think of them as being bone feeders like hyenas or griffin vultures and things like this. I think it's incidental. So yeah, I think for small prey, they are probably just macerating it. And yeah, it's kind of like a pre-digestive, just battering something before they eat it, in the way that birds will smash a lizard against a tree repeatedly before they eat it. I think for the big stuff, they do bite bone, but I don't think they're eating very much of it, because what we find are those scrape feeding traces rather than chunks of bone bitten in half. So yeah, I think the bite power actually is primarily when it comes to processing prey. I mean, the initial kill bite obviously is part of that, and occasionally going for big stuff. I don't think you quite said this, but I just want to be clear. I don't think they're hyena-like bone crunchers, which I think people think they are. Because they, again, it's like that trade-off thing. Having the capacity to do something and doing something are not the same thing. I think they have the capacity to chew up and macerate enormously heavy bones, but I don't think it's a normal part of their behaviour.
We all have the capacity to do the can, and none of us are currently doing it.
Yeah, and probably shouldn't either.
Probably shouldn't.
I don't know if I have the capacity to do so.
I think you do. I think if somebody looked at your skeleton, in the future someday, they'd have gone, This is a perfectly adapted.
Yeah, a lot of joint flexibility. Yeah, you can get a femur and just spin it round in the hip socket. Whether or not you could do that when you were alive is another matter entirely.
Those work done by Casey Holliday and et al. They looked at the skull structure and the tooth morphology, and they're really, really robust in T-Rex. Like very conical teeth, very robust teeth. The top of the skull is really robust. Generally, the palate is also quite robust. And so the T-Rex skull is almost like built to resist high stresses, kind of like hyena. So they were like biting hard was part of its like evolutionary selection pressure that shaped that lineage.
Absolutely. I just wonder how much of it might be some kind of, not quite holdover, but this pattern is true of most of the smaller tyrannosaurs, which are not. Oh,
but have you seen? Well, so I guess this might not be published, but they're looking at differences in the different tyrannosaurs and juveniles, especially things like ontogenetically evolutionary. And there's a really huge difference between adult T-Rex and the other tyrannosaurs if you look at them mechanically, like functionally. Biomechanically, T-Rex seems to be like a league of its own. The adult T-Rex. It can't
be that much different from Tarbosaurus.
Even in Tarbosaurus, the skull is a lot less robust and wide.
Again, though, you're right. If muscle mass is that important, then you don't need to be that much bigger to have quite a lot more, and then it scales up, and then it...
Yeah, so I think there is something that T-Rex, that lineage, that species, evolution along the lineage leading to Tyrannosaurus rex as a species seems to have been a little bit more unique compared even to its closest relatives.
Oh yeah, I mean they're definitely doing something weird, but there has been a couple of nice studies looking at the rate of bite marks on bone, and they're much higher in Tyrannosaur faunas than non-Tyrannosaur faunas. But I'm not aware that they're any higher in T-Rex faunas and Tarbosaurus faunas than other Tyrannosaur, Albertosaur, or Daspletosaurus.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I'd come back to with T-Rex in particular is, we've got at least half a dozen good skeletons where most of the rib cage is there, and we're not finding lots of stomach contents like we do for some others. And again, if they're truly bone macerators, you think we'd find more than one coprolite in the Hell Creek. They have a super bite power. They are definitely very good at biting through and into bone. I'm not convinced that it's a specialist hunting technique or a bone feeding technique. I suspect they're doing something weird in processing their food, which is something we know Tyrannosaurs do, because we know they've got their scrape-feeding premaxillary teeth, and we know that they go all the way back to the earliest Tyrannosauroids, with things like Guanlong and Delong have this. So Tyrannosaurs have always been feeding in a different way to all other theropods, whether they were small or big. And so I just wonder if it's a part of that. It's another one of those, T-Rex is doing something awkward and it's not obvious what. But I think the obvious explanation that, it's a bone specialist, which a lot of people have said, rarely in the literature, more often in discussions, I think is... Going back to what we've been saying, it's oversimplifying a much more complicated problem, and there's probably a lot of subtlety to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I felt reassured studying about biting in dinosaurs and theropods is that there's a reason why T-Rex is such a popular dinosaur. And it's not only because it's, the biggest dinosaur, but it is like one of the weirdest theropods out there. So...
Yeah, it absolutely has the weirdness problem. Like, people don't realise how weird T-Rex is because everyone talks about it. And my other go-to is giraffes, and elephants. Like, if it wasn't for the fact that almost all zoos have giraffe and elephants, and every documentary has them in, and they're every kid's alphabet book, you would look at a giraffe and go, "The hell is that?" But they're so normalised that we forget how weird they are. And I think T-Rex has that really big problem, is that it's a unbelievably weird animal, and that actually then people overlook that because it's a T-Rex.
This then leads to the most important pertinent question in paleontology is would T-Rex have actually beaten Tyrannosaurus in Jurassic Park?
Very important question, Dave. Dave's actually answered that before. He's already answered it on the podcast. So
and I gave the same answer when I did that Insider video. Yeah. Which is who wins in a fight between is the most boring and trivial thing that you can argue about, and we shouldn't even discuss it, but it's T-Rex. But like you said, for bite power, it's got double what Carcharodontosaurus has.
But what if the fight was at sea?
Oh. Well, it wouldn't matter because Spinosaurus isn't aquatic.
But it's more aquatic than T-Rex.
Yeah, but that's like saying rats are more aquatic than cats. I mean, they are, but...
I think that's a brilliant ending to the very topical thing about Joshua. Thank you so much for your time. That is amazing. Are you on Twitter or things like that where people can
I am
follow
on
you?
Twitter, yeah.
What is your Twitter handle?
At Dr. Mambo Bob. Mambo like the music.
Thank you so much for being on Terrible Lizard. That was really excellent. A massive thank you to Manabu there. That was a brilliant interview. I really loved the idea of the muscle zigzagging to give you a constant pressure as you munch down on a Triceratops.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and actually it dovetails with a project I've been trying to do on some theropod jaws for ages, about constant bite force, and I've been struggling to get the project together. But yeah, if that's correct, which I suspect it is, that fits really nicely with some other ideas that are out there, so that's pretty nice.
Excellent. Well, we will be back next week with some more amazing interviews, and until then, after 3, shall we roar?
Yeah, go on then.
1, 2, 3. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. For extra content, become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. Dave's book, The Future of Dinosaurs, or How Fast Did T-Rex Run, is available to buy now. Do check out Izzy Lawrence's other podcasts and books by visiting iszi.com. Please send questions, suggestions, and other feedback to terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. And catch up with old live episodes on youtube.com/ISZITube. Do leave us a review, it does make a difference, and find us on social media and say hello with the hashtag Terrible Lizards. Thanks again to our patrons. Without your support, we wouldn't be making this series.